Hello, everyone. Welcome to Shelter in Places, Season 5, Episode 1. Shelter in Places is the public program run by students of the new Center for Research and Practice. It is now in its 5th season, and it tries to address multiple questions of our theoretical and political landscape, specific theme, landscape by opening a conversation between students, guests, and the public. Each episode features a specific theme and two guests, and if you are curious about our previous season, you can see them in our YouTube channel. On another note, we also wanted to remind you about the fact that our scholarship applications for certificate students at the new Center for Research and Practice are currently open until the 6th of September. You can apply and get a scholarship covering from 20 up to 100% of the tuition to one of our 4 certificate programs: Transdisciplinary Studies, run by Jason Mukherjee, Art and Curatorial Practice by Mohamed Salemi, Postplanetary Universal Design by Ed Keller and Carla Leighton, and Critical Philosophy, run by Reza Negarestani. To see more information about the application process and also our upcoming seminars for the Fall-Winter 2021 season, make sure to stay tuned to our social media and also check our website, thenewcenter.org. I will post it, Benjamin Bratton's work spans philosophy, architecture, computer science, and geopolitics. He's professor of visual arts at University of California, San Diego, program director of the Terraforming program at the Strelka Institute, professor of digital design at the European Graduate School, and visiting professor at SCI-Arc, the Southern California Institute of Architecture, and NYU Shanghai. He's the author of several books, including The Revenge of the Real, Politics for a Post-Pandemic World, published by Verso 2021, and The Stack on Software and Sovereignty, MIT Press 2016. Lukas Likavcan is a philosopher focusing on technology, ecology, and visual cultures. He received his degree in philosophy and PhD in environmental studies at Masaryk University in Brno, Czech Republic. Cavitchen is a faculty member at Center for Audiovisual Studies, FAMU, in Prague, Strelka Institute for Media, Architecture and Design in Moscow, and the new Center for Research and Practice. He's also a member of Prague-based Collective Display Association for Research and Collective Practice, and an author of Introduction to Comparative Planetology, published by Strelka Press in 2019.
So I'm going to read the curatorial text that we made for this conversation, and my question is going to be like immediately continuous from it. So the convergence of technological acceleration and climate crisis and global emergencies like the COVID-19 pandemic, which aren't expected to become any less frequent, are already rapidly changing the ways earthly existence is organized, even though this seems to be only the beginning. Both of our guests have at some point drawn on Carl Schmitt's concept of the nomos, a concrete order which manifests itself in space and infrastructure, to deal with such expanded geopolitics ranging from technology platforms to ecosystems. Yet they are both critical of Schmitt, with his reactionary emphasis on mythical thinking, the drawing of borders, and the authenticity of land and nation. In contrast to Schmitt's phobia of abstraction and of technical governance, our guests are comfortable with the abstract, with mixing nomos and economics, and even with a possible end of the capitalized political. We are choosing to call this transition one from the nomos of the earth to planetary nomics. This word nomics here echoes Schmitt's concept of the nomos, But at the same time, nomics breaks with Schmittian nomos by suggesting resonances of economic governance and technological administration, things which Schmitt despised and wanted to separate from nomos at all costs. In the stack, Bratton drew critically from Schmitt to construct his concept of platform sovereignty and the nomos of the cloud. He seems to have progressively distanced himself from any residual Schmittianism, as his strong criticism of one of the best known Schmittians of our time, Giorgio Agamben, has made abundantly clear. For the COVID-19 era Bratton, Schmitt seems to amount to the parochialist, anti-vax, climate denialist refusal of global scientific governmentality. Perhaps for that reason, Bratton seems to drift from concepts like nomos and sovereignty towards planetary governance and positive biopolitics. This would seem like a movement away from Schmitt and towards a certain Foucault, though not the common wrong anti-power reading of him. In fact, though Agamben canonized a negative reading of biopolitics by equating it with the Heideggerian enframing or Gestalt, for Foucault, biopolitics was always positive, not in the sense of being necessarily good, but of being an activity which makes, live, and produces action. For Foucault, biopolitics, like power in general, is neither good nor bad. Power is everywhere, and there are only different regimes of power, biopolitics being one of them. Thus, when Bratton speaks of positive biopolitics, he seems in a way to call us back from Agamben to Foucault to remind us that being governed not only isn't necessarily a bad thing, it can be a good thing, as the pandemic situation shows. While Bratton is a very radical critique of localized terrestrial politics, Likavcan's comparative planetology seems relatively more open to what he calls the terrestrial cosmogram and to the multiplicity of worlds, even if his emphasis is still on the deep, non-subjective image of the planet and of the Earth without us. So my question to both of you would be this: how exactly would you unpack the way you see today the place of this concrete earthly architectural conception of order, which is expressed in Schmitt's concept of the nomos? What do you keep from it? What do you throw away? How do you restructure? For example, how Benjamin would, what would he restructure about the stack today and what not, And also, how does this play out in the question of scale, of the relation between these local and global levels, the mythical space of phenomenological experience and the geometrical space of planetary scale science, the concrete order of nomos and the statistical governance of populations? So yeah, that would be my initial quite open question, the concept of the nomos and this possibility of nomics and the relation between the terrestrial, the global, the local. Please feel free, whoever wants to begin.
Okay, so perhaps I'll start. Thanks very much for the introduction, the excellent introduction. That ties together a lot of threads in my recent work, I think, quite well and articulates it quite beautifully. So thank you for that. Thanks also for the invitation. And it's great to have the opportunity to have an extended conversation with Lukas as well. And so very much looking forward to this. So I suppose that there's a lot of, since the richness of the introduction suggests a lot of entry points, and maybe sort of start with identifying some of those entry points before actually walking through them. You're correct that the first part of the first third of the stack is sort of dealing with the question of the nomos, not only in Schmitt's invocation of it. The term exists, of course, before Schmitt, as in his book Nomos of the Earth, 1950, is sort of a kind of history of the history of the concept and a history of what the concept refers to over a longer period of time. The key point of differentiation, I sort of have said, so, I mean, maybe for those who are less familiar with the etymology of all of this, the term nomos for Schmitt, in the way Schmitt invokes it, refers first to a kind of underlying logic by which governance would subdivide the earth in such a way as to make a logic of jurisdiction of the law, how the law speaks, possible. And so, for example, in the early modern Westphalian model of the state, that represents a subdivision of land that becomes isomorphic and discrete across the bordering, a drawing of literally a line in the dirt, upon which interiority and exteriority, friend and enemy, can be identified first through the conceptualization of how we will divide the earth, then through the physical demarcation in the soil, and then the subsequent production of those friend-enemy dynamics from this. And then second, for him, the connotation of the nomos is then the geopolitical order that emerges and stabilizes over time from that primordial subdivision. And what he suggests is that, identifies sort of obvious thing is that most of the earth is not covered by the land, the terrace, the terrestrial in this way, but by water. And the question of how it is that the peculiarity in that regard of how it is to the oceanic movements, the kind of axial, polydirectional, amorphous capacity for naval circulation complicates this fundamental thing. And for him, it is always described as a kind of not just a transgression, but as a kind of inferior and contaminant, not necessarily contaminating, but a kind of an inferior logic of spatial order in this regard. So there's this fundamental distinction between the land and the sea. The land being the kind of primordial form, the sea, which Virilio then takes up this kind of line of thinking with this fundamental distinction of land and sea. And Virilio identifies and sort of layers on the aerial movement into the sea, and then subsequently informational flows into the sea as well. All of that anything that constitutes this sort of polydirectionality that isn't fixed and grounded in this way constitutes this what Schmitt and later Dugan call this Atlanticist kind of sort of view. Now, first I should say that the way in which that I rehearse this in the stack is not to say, okay, so clearly there's the kind, you see where the lineage with Heidegger aligns with this quite nicely, quite clearly, but also Virilio should say. The underlying Heideggerian logic of Virilio becomes clear through the reading of Schmitt. Is that it is not to say that, okay, is essentially not to accept this framework and to say, all right, we have this virtual naval, logistical, glacial, polydirectional, abstract, geometric space versus mathematized space versus the grounded, physical, geological space, one or the other, and that planetary scale computation is, as Schmitt and Virilio and all these other people would identify it, in this second category of the virtual, and hooray for that. That isn't the argument. The argument is that distinction itself is wrong, that you cannot describe planetary scale computation through their framework. You can't describe it as either land or sea. You can't describe it as physical versus virtual, because it is all of those things at the same time. And so it is the abstraction of mathematized information through networks. It is the condensation and compression and co-locations of spaces like what we're doing right now in the context of the Zoom thing. But it is also itself a heavy physical terraforming initiative, planetary scale computation. It is not virtual. It is not immaterial. It is fiber optic cables. It is mountain-sized data centers. It is disgorged metals and materials that are folded into making this cognitive layer. It is a deeply planetary, not just in the sense of scale, but in the sense of its source. It is a way in which we have folded the planet to produce a capacity for information flows that happen otherwise. And so it's the primary argument is to refuse this distinction in the first place, in order to then ask the question of what would be then the gnomic logic of the cloud, broadly speaking, or like what is the ways in which planetary scale computation is one, constitutes first, then that first notion of the nomos, a logic for the organization of space, and second, a geopolitical order that emerges from that logic. And there's no answer to that question yet, because we're living right through the middle of it right now, in terms of how this is working out. And so the first question is will have to be just describing the present moment through that lens and looking at the way the US, China, geopolitical, the hemispherical stacks and the divisions between this as well, the kind of geopolitical orders that emerge from this based on states' claims to be able to produce and model data at the exclusion of other states. The ways in which, on the one hand, you have large-scale cloud platforms taking on many of the traditional roles of the state in a transnational kind of way. And on the other hand, you also have transnational states that are evolving into cloud platforms. Is there none of these happening simultaneously? And so this is posed as a question that, again, we can observe as a lens through which we can observe the contemporary of interest to political science or computer science or the rest of this to sort of understand what's going on. There's then the second aspect of your question, which is more normative or projective or speculative, which is what should it be? Like given this condition, what would be the preferred architecture of that arrangement given this context? And that's also a very interesting question, but in one that we, with Strelka and other places, we've been trying to kind of come up with lots of little prototypes that might add up to something later on. We'll see. But that's a kind of secondary question. So maybe I'll leave it at that and bounce it back to Lukas as a way of kind of just setting the framework for how I approach this question of nomos.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. It's a delight to have this conversation with you. And also thank you, Zenobio and Ze, for the introductory text. I actually, only when I was listening to you, Ze, as you were reading the text, it clicked to me what actually you mean by this conceptual shift from the nomos to the nomics. And actually, given the fact that lately I was kind of more immersed in the economic literature, it's actually a good occasion to unpack that a bit more. But let me say at first that I guess my kind of entry point is different, but kind of complementary to that of Ben's. Because also, if I look at the very beginning of the Nomos of the Earth by Schmitt, there is this first title of it is, which says that the law is the unity of order and orientation. And I think there's an interesting kind of oscillation between the subjective and objective pole of nomics in general. On the one hand, having the orientation here as something that is associated with an orienting subject that navigates themselves in a kind of environment, and then the order, which it is still a bit open question to me to what extent this order is based on some intrinsic affordances of the environment or on projection of some system of values or rules on that environment by some kind of subjectivity. And actually my intuition is that I would like to see more of the former, more of the intrinsic affordances being mobilized as a sort of nomics. And of course, Schmitt means nomos of the earth with the small e. To me, it will be more with the capital E, as the E as in the planetary, also kind of understanding of the earth. And so, I mean, it is not about zooming out. I wouldn't really say that we get the planetary when we zoom out from the local or from the kind of situated perspective. To me, it is more about how the whole topological register, so to speak, changes the moment we invoke the planetary. Because to me, there is, with the change of the topological register comes the change of the nomological system as well that we use. That's, I can explain that on the example of the book essay I have written for Strelka, the Introduction to Comparative Planetology, where I compare these 5 figures of the planet. You can say it's a kind of collection of topological models: the planetary, the globe, the terrestrial, Earth without us, and spectral Earth. And so when I was writing the book, I was saying that, or it seemed to me that, okay, they have many different connotations. They have geopolitical vision inscribed, each of them different kind of geopolitical vision inscribed in them. They have aesthetic regimes that are distinct to each other. They are also kinds of different design briefs, also different cosmological models. And actually, I was still seeking, and I'm still seeking, a kind of language that would unify these disparate connotations. And I think that topology can be a good option here. Because to me, currently my research spans a lot the ways how we can exploit spatial metaphors to index or articulate some kind of nomological coordinates. And so when I, for example, ask in the book, what does it mean to, so I mean, things like, for what Earth do we design, for example, we should read that question as a question of what is the topological model that you use in your intervention. Many times tacit, implicit topological model that is a precondition of some kind of design intervention. And so that's also where I am at the moment with my research, seeing how different topological assumptions can be made explicit in cultural practices, discourses, political interventions. And I think a lot of research at the moment to me is also focused on what would be the topological model that would enable some kind of alternative cosmopolitanism, which is already a kind of project that goes away from the purely descriptive to a kind of speculative dimension. And this kind of speculative dimension, it can be best unpacked by actually saying that, to me, it is the planetary, which is this, this placeholder term for the topological model that would enable this kind of alternative cosmopolitanism. Since in a way, remembering reading recently The Revenge of the Real, at the very end of the book, there is this claim by Ben that he's a globalist. And I think it's a kind of claim that I would also subscribe to. But, it's a kind of globalism that is very different from the kind of globalism that is criticized by ultra or anti-globalist discourses.
I guess my question directly relates to this post-pandemic politics and the planetary, and it follows from that, I guess. In the beginning of the pandemic, I imagined that this event would bring some notion of the planetary conditions we live in, and thought that some Western countries, of course not Brazil, nor USA, because of Bolsonaro and Trump at the time, would sketch what might be in the future planetary politics or nomics, if you will, but it actually didn't. On the contrary, the countries were and still are more national than ever. Despite the internet and the connections, the networks and so on, where we have other passports and citizen status, in the actual states, we are in an enclosure. Of course, not all countries, but Brazil will still in this enclosure, of course, because of Bolsonaro and so on. So vaccine trends are turning to some kind of new passports and new visas. If with this global pandemic at that level, we didn't realize the planetary mode or model, what would we need to do it, to realize it? Because we are kind of running out of time, because this is not the last emergency. We're gonna need more governance and planetary governance and saints and modes and so on, but the states and the actors are not dealing with this so well. So I'm not kind of very optimistic with it. So what do you both think about it?
Yeah, I strongly agree. I mean, one of the Revenge of the Real book begins, as you know, with an observation that the sort of primary sociological phenomenon of the pandemic was this massive resorting and refiltering of an otherwise mobile and circulatory global population back into constituent countries of passport. The Italians back to Italy, the Brazilians back to Brazil, the Texans back to Texas, and so forth. The kind of like musical chairs, everything stopped, and this sort of like default position was set in motion, even though the virus itself was planetary in scope, even though vaccine distributions is planetary in scope, mask distributions and production, even though all the sort of governing interventions that would constitute the response of the immunological commons, if you like, to the presence of the virus were planetary in scope. It seemingly, from an utter lack of, imagination or capacity or understanding, we resulted to this default, as you say, of a kind of Westphalian enclosure, which is kind of much more, hopefully, something that we will look back upon as a bizarre, as perhaps one of the most bizarre phenomenon of the whole episode. But also, as you sort of intimate, we can also then see this as a kind of massive experiment in comparative governance, where different countries and different political cultures dealt with this different aspects of this same condition variously well or poor in one way or another. And so I very much agree that clearly we should see pandemic, climate change, any number of things, refugee issues, any number of kinds of things as basically rather sort of obvious symptoms that demand a capacity for collective self-composition of the response, operating at a scale commensurate with the phenomenon that needs this response. Right? It's not just a matter of like, we need this giant federal body that is supervising all this shit, but rather there is this, it's just simply this, that the capacity for a collective response at the scale of the phenomenon, that might be just the baseline definition of what we mean by planetary governance in this regard. It's not a governance as an external force, but governance as how it is a society is able to sense, make sense, model, and recursively act back upon itself compositionally with care and reason. And so I'm also not necessarily optimistic in the sense of like a betting market that all of this is about to come about. But it's become clear that the tendency of a kind of let's say a kind of deterritorialization, if you like, of all capacities for this capacity for large-scale self-composition that is durable and defensible in the name of freedom and so forth is perhaps has reached a point where that technique cannot monopolize the imagination quite as much as it had. Right? It's not that I would wish that this somehow goes away, but rather that it becomes better tuned with other kinds of approaches. But to the question of the planetary political, I think we need to, pass to Lukas, I think we need to think of it in two ways. Like one is that, to your point about Trump and Bolsonaro and Boris Johnson and Modi and all the ways in which the sort of the recent years of populist politics has failed this pandemic in any number of, in all kinds of different ways. We should remember, as I said, like that itself was a kind of planetary politics. That I don't just mean like the Steve Bannon networks that were going around and trying to instigate all of these kinds of things, but there was an idea that to the extent of whatever level of coordination or just emergent kind of thing as well, that there were, ironically enough, perhaps considerable, not just correspondences, but linkages between a lot of these sort of nationalist, localist, populist movements like strangely enough, they represent a globalization of politics, an understanding that politics isn't just one nation at a time. It actually constitutes at a planetary scale, and they were using the national parliamentary systems as a way to instigate a global politics, weirdly enough, through the ideology of anti-globalism and anti-this as well. And so one of the questions I ask in the book is that more strange, or is it actually more strange for the left to try to instigate a global politics through the technique of isolated local movements, and internationalism through localism versus a localism through internationalism? I'm not sure which is more bizarre. But I think one of the things that the left needs to sort of get over itself with it a little bit in terms of is the idea that is the development of truly, of a kind of planetary platforms and policies and even parties is probably right around the corner. And so things like, the response to Cambridge Analytica, for example, obviously all sorts of things very pernicious about this, but one of the things that shouldn't be quite so scandalous is the idea that there was foreign interference in the election, right? The planetarity of all national elections are now planetary in implications and scope. And I think whoever understands that and coordinates in relationship to that first will have a huge advantage in terms of using the existing political institutions that we recognize as political institutions. The other half of your questions is the kinds of planetary politics we need are not necessarily the ones that exist inside those political institutions. One of the points that we sort of keep trying to articulate in different ways to try to make it clear for people is that and this goes back to Schmitt in a way, that the conventional distinction between the geopolitics and geotechnologies needs to be rethought. That it's not just that you've got geopolitics that then implements geotechnologies to do kinds of things. And it's not simply that you've got geotechnologies that technologically determine the geopolitics, but that I think a better reading of the history of the global more generally is one in which these are thought very much coterminously in relationship with each other. And so if we understand that, if we sort of take the conditions of the platform or whatever you like of that planetary politics of carbon reduction and transformations of energy systems and a global Medicare for all kind of policy, whatever it is you would want to add on to this list of large scale, the actual program of this, all of these are massive. These are massive works projects. These constitute massive social, political, and technological infrastructures. Right? They are Green New Deal times, times a multiple in their scope. But one of the things, the last point is that I think is interesting about the Green New Deal, both in terms of the way in which there's lots of them all over the world. Like it was a kind of like an example of how a global platform could be emerged and sort of instantiate itself through different parliaments, but that it shifted the logic of what the political was in an important way. That it shifted the idea and basically argued that the function of the state now is the administration of ecosystems. That's the function of the state. The function of the state is to administer and organize carbon flows and energy flows and biodiversity, not the kind of Rousseau-y, kind of the democratic model of the function of the state is the mediation of public voice. The public voice is then seen as a means to an end for this more fundamental purpose of the state, which is this management of ecosystem. That in of itself, regardless of whether any of these bills get passed in the coming years, is also, I think, an important point of leverage that I think should not be overlooked.
Yeah, let me elaborate on that last point, because to me, seeing this kind of thinking also, it gives me a kind of way how to tap into it through actually two rotations of the political, I would call it, or shifting the lenses through which we look at the political today. And the first actually taps into what you just said, because the implication of that is that maybe there is a need to update a bit, kind of like an old Marxist virtue of sometimes looking at the politics from the side of the economical. because actually, I mean, I don't necessarily mean the kind of standard model of the infrastructure superstructure. What I mean more, also based on the conversations that I had with the students at the new center, is the kind of view that, for example, Kojin Karatani implies, where he looks into modes of exchange rather than modes of production. And this kind of exchange in itself, like the name exchange suggests a kind of practice that is more comfortable with the kind of metabolic ontology of the economy. And that's the way also how ecological economics in a way describes what economy is. It's a kind of artificial metabolism. And I think this metaphor of metabolism, it's not just a metaphor. I think we can really think about it as a basic ontology for the kind of the way how perhaps the state and the governance should look at the ecosystem that is managed. But it doesn't stop only there, because to me, this quality of exchange is also about how to arrange, let's say, a more everyday and personal affairs, to privilege exchange as basically something that is a practice which is based on communication, which is based on exchange that is not necessarily an exchange of the commodity kind, but more of what also Karatani talks about as, the exchange of the gift, for example, and think about the gift as something which is a bit forgotten register in the contemporary economic thinking, can be also nicely mobilized in the relation of how we think about the energy, especially the energy that comes from the renewables, as a sort of like a gift in a perhaps even Bataille, in the way how the Bataille would think about that. And the second rotation is that, this geological part of the politics, it's something that we can even call, I don't know, like deep politics, so to speak. It's a kind of politics that relates to this ancestral pre-human limits of how the artificial metabolism of the economy can produce and reproduce itself. And with this figure of limit on the stage, then it instructs us first to look more into the biochemistry biogeochemistry in this way, and also to see how today planetary scale computation seems to somehow approximate this kind of geological working of the political, that actually it taps into this register of this deep politics and becomes, people like Jennifer Gabriels would call it becoming environmental of computation. And this is something where actually we get also back to the nomics, because the nomic arrangement is actually changed by the way how deeply the planetary scale computation penetrates into this layer. And it is a layer that I think needs to be better described and discovered, because it's a layer that became a bit forgotten in the situation when we primarily think about politics as a discursive practice, because it also has this like deeply metabolic material implications. And with the concept of exchange, I think more than communication in the discursive sense, it is about transactions of energy, matter, and all the associated elements.
Yeah, just to very quickly tag on to that before the next question, I think that one of the things that points to is the fragility of the Schmittian concept of the capital T, capital P, the political, as a discrete domain, which is interesting. Strangely enough, one of the areas that Schmitt's work has been most influential on the left has been this valorization and embrace of the political as a domain, and interestingly, oftentimes at the expense of governmentality. That is, the left finds itself fetishizing the political and demonizing governmentality, the actual organization of exchanges or matter or whatever it is constituted, the compositionality of those flows. Whereas maybe the argument could be made that since 1976, China, you may have seen maybe arguably a kind of inverse of these, where there was a more of an embrace of governmentality at the expense of the endless agonism and contestation of the political in the Schmittian or Mouffe or Rancière kind of sense of this as well. And so I think to a certain extent, this question of planetary governance that you pose is one that is this is the right term in this sort of way. There's a planetary politics, which we may understand in one way, and planetary governance, which we may see in another way. and the relationship between the discursive and the technical that operate in each of those registers are not identical to one another. They might not be exactly the same in this way.
I think it's also a result of, investing normativity solely into the human, that we end up in this kind of agonistic logic. Because, to some extent, I see it as a kind of Kantian urge, on the one hand, to actually having as much of the moral agency and political agency to be invested only in the human. But also, if you look into, I don't know, like critique of judgment, suddenly we see that he also has this urge to invest a bit of the normativity into the nature. Or what would be in the modernist language called nature. But I mean, this kind of urge is actually never fully realized in Kantian philosophy. But I think there's a kind of link to a critical theory here as well, in how it uses this strategy of critique through unmasking some gestures of alienation and looking basically at, for example, problems of ecology, at basically being of our own making, in that way that it is a result of some false projection and of some autonomy on an object that in fact is fully in our control. As would be the case, for example, with this reading of the political ecology, where, for example, the kind of limits that are imposed on the economy are basically of our own making, and are the result of just the result of the previous human exploitation, which is partly true, of course, but it forgets about this active agency on the side of the planet that still has these qualities that precede the human and exceed the human into the future, also in terms of the biochemistry and all these other physical pre-human universe.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Lukas is sort of suggesting here. I think it's also, while he was talking, I was thinking, he's like, that's why so many Marxists are against space exploration, because they actually, the question of the planetarity is actually so irrelevant to the deep social determinism that is the commitment there, that it becomes, it's just an obscure obsession for them. But one of the things I think is also raised by your sort of point was the way in which, as you suggest, even the political and politics as we understand it has always been, to a greater degree, contextualized and conditioned and delimited by its technical and ecological niches and constraints and possibilities. It's not, though, it's somehow in the 21st century, now there is this merging of the political and technology, finally, like the cyborgian condition is made new as some kind of contemporary innovation. It always has been. What needs to be accounted for now is the way in which, of course, Kant being, Hegel and the rest also being kind of examples, but also back to the Greeks, how in the Western tradition that context was blinkered and was erased and suppressed and subdivided. The return of the ecological in the conditionality of the political, but also the recognition of the technological context for the possibility of the polis, the possibility of the cosmos, of the cosmological, the possibility of the demos, is also a kind of reckoning that I think needs to happen. One aspect of that reckoning, I think, is, to Lukas's point about the human agency, is particularly in the Kantian tradition, is there has tended to be a conflation of the subjectivity with agency and the organization and cultivation of the subject as the position from which agency exudes, which is not something any engineer would understand in terms of where the agency in a socio-technical system sits, or even after network theory for that matter. The agency is always distributed within lots and lots of relays and points of exchange and medium and all the rest of this. It's a basic principle of media studies, even, to where the location of agency and the location of the subject are understood to be actually quite different. The worst thing was always not only subjectivity and agency are conflated, but subjectivity, agency, and identity become conflated into a kind of triad, such that a sense of a deficit of agency it might be remedied with an amplification of identity. I think that's in a certain sense where a kind of algorithm for the populist politics of the last few years is that is a sense of a lack of agency becomes channeled through an acceleration or amplification of identity. And this is possible because of this conflation of subjectivity, identity, and agency in the first place. So I think I mean this as a way to kind of echo and extend some of the things that Lukas has offered us.
I think one point that is interesting to connect here, and I'd like to put this question in terms of like how do we think of the interaction between these different cosmograms that Lukas describes, and also like what you raised about the possibility of a unification, like a totalization or convergence of those cosmograms, and going back like to Ben's initial response, I think it's quite an interesting point from which to think this, is that you described this distinction, right, that should be surpassed in terms of the relation between, the abstraction of geometricized technological systems and the concreteness or the materiality of the geophysical Earth, right? And it's interesting, like in terms of the problem of the nomos and nomics, that in Schmitt, he even talks about how he doesn't consult so much like geography or, any kind of scientific conception of the Earth. And he starts by saying, in the mythical language, the Earth is the mother of law. So like his idea of the terrestrial is completely traversed by mythical thought, right? And there's this like phenomenological, mythical world construction that is, Heideggerian or mythic. And this would be, and I want to like complicate the problem of scale here. This would be like related to this localism in Schmitt. But then I wanted to bring in, because I think this connects with this other point, I wanted to bring in the problem of what Zenobia wanted was asking, like how do we expect this change to happen? I think one important, interesting way in which you guys answer this, I think Benjamin talks about it quite explicitly, is how you can expect the infrastructural change to precede the political change, like the changes in the infrastructure would like possibly force this planetarization of governance, right? But then I want to ask, like, does this planetarization, this passage to the level of abstraction of the planet, does it correspond necessarily to the transposition from this mythical idea of locality to the scientific image, both of the models and of the geophysical milieu that the models are related to in a modern scientific point of view? And I wanted to ask that in terms of what Yuk Hoi brings in his kind of bridging of this correlation when he is discussing the problem of the planetary, becoming of governance and of technology and of the relation between technology and ecology, but he wants it to be non-totalized. And then he calls back this notion of locality and even of myth, of different cosmologies, Chinese cosmology and all that. And he wants to bring this in a way to the planetary level. He wants to like construct a planetary techno-scientific ecology in a way that is non-totalized, in the sense that you would have like different cosmotechnics, as he calls it, which would be informed by different localities. And then the question of the local and the question of the planetary are sort of bridged, right? Because then in Lukas' terms, right, you don't have necessarily just the terrestrial as something, mythical, experimented and cultural and local, and the the global as mathematized, but you have the planet as something which can be thought as convergent and totalizing, or can be thought as divergent and non-totalized. So I would like to know how would you think about that, and how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so thanks for that. Yeah, you and I have been in dialogue about this for quite some time, and I think our thought overlaps in some parts and diverges in others. I'm trying to sort of link the first half and the second half of your question. I would say that there's maybe one of the unfortunate things about the conversation is that we're using this term planetary and planetarity to describe very different kinds of possibilities and conditions of phenomenon. And it might be very easy, I think, even for me to sort of get confused as to which we're talking about in the ways. But the suggestion that I think I'm proposing, sort of looking at here as well, is that the planetary and the planetarity of the condition of thought has, in a way, has always been. It's not a scale. It doesn't represent like it's not a sort of another word for the global, or another word for the very large, or another word for the cosmopolitan. It constitutes something much closer to what Lukas is getting of the kind of the geological, geophysical, material condition for the possibility of any kind of gnomic or compositional organization whatsoever, including thought itself. Right, and this is also one of the ways in which, tangentially, some of the ways in which more recent work around that I've been doing on AI has been also locating this by basically first locating the sort of evolutionary conditions of natural intelligence as this process by which a planet over a period of billions of years comes to fold matter in such a way as to produce carbon-based assemblages that are capable of not just sentience, but sapience in the form of primate brains. That itself is a conjugation of the geology, if you like, a folding and of the table of elements to produce the possibility of sapience. And so one of the things that, and then subsequent to this, in more recent times, with the development of computational methods of computational abstraction and alienation, as Lukas, as we put it, been able to then discover things like how old the planet is and that the planet is warming, right? Climate change itself being a epistemological accomplishment of planetary scale computation. And so first we should say that this planetarity is understood as the precondition for the possibility of thought, that then makes possible the thought that discovers its precondition, right? And so if you want to think of that as a kind of Hegelian self-disclosing, you can if you want. I'm not so interested in even making this kind of argument, because I see it less as a kind of, I think it is actually not as a kind of noosphere, but actually as a kind of physical phenomenon that actually takes place, right? And so that's a kind of planetarity that is a precondition that's not about myth, that's not about Mother Earth or the kind of primordial unknowability of the deep and dark and mystical past from which the elders came. It is about an understanding really of this, of the chemical underpinnings of this fiction, right? And all of which is taking place in the deep time of the present moment, if you like, this 4 billion year old present moment that is sort of synchronically folding itself. That is the preconditional planetarity. There's then, we might say, is that kind of propositional planetarity, which is, okay, thus, how do we then decide to compose ourselves in such a way that the deep time of the future is as long as the deep time of the past, that the possibility of biodiversity and cognitive diversity can continue long into the future? What is the conditions for that durability to stave off the risk of extinction? So that there is a future of intelligence that is millions of years and hundreds of millions of years into the future. What is the compositional preconditions for that we need now to decide? That's the compositional, or as I say, projected planetarity. And so what I think that I think for Yuke, and he'll have to speak for himself, but I think for Yuke, the first planetarity is not necessarily so important. It's not as important for him as it is for me, in terms of understanding the condition for thought. Like, I think he's probably more comfortable with philosophy beginning from a not necessarily scientific first principle, but I think he might disagree with that. But the condition of the compositional planetarity on the kind of the other kind of hand as well, I strongly agree that part of what would make possible that long-term viability for the future of intelligence would constitute a calibration of diversification and diversification on the one hand and communicativity on the other. That it's actually possible for exchange to take. There has to be enough of a regularization that exchange can take place, but not so much regularization that you have entropy. And so what Stiegler calls negenthropocene, this sort of structure of producing a kind of structures of difference. Like I think there's a lot of problems with his invocation of this, but that is so diversity as both as a condition for the long-term viability of the first planetarity. I think we agree with. Where I think we disagree, though, is where this diversity comes from. Necessarily, or where the first instinct for thinking about where this diversity would come from. It seems to me that Yuke's first instinct for this is to look, which is not inappropriate, is to look at where forms of cultural and cognitive and symbolic diversity already exist, which he identifies is in kind of extant cultural traditions, which some would argue in his work are sort of reified and made a touch too organic than they should be, and then suggesting that this compositional planetarity and the diversity that we need from that must be the result of the kind of drawing upon this reserve, if you like, of cultural traditions, but also in a way refortifying those cultural traditions away from each other. But peculiarly, it's also based on an understanding of the planetarity as a scale, like that the where this takes place is at a bounded terrestrial local scale. And this is why Yuke's dialogues with Dugin have even taken place at all, I think, because there's some understanding that there's sort of a natural boundedness of these terrestrial domains that is a given in understanding where this diversification comes from. I think if you start with the presumption that the planetary is not just a large scale, but that it is equally chemical, it has just as much with the very, very small in the aggregation of carbon dioxide molecules and viruses that invade this as well, that it's not that the local itself, to invert the Latourian axiom, there's no such thing as the local. The local itself is kind of, it's a phenomenological position through which planetary phenomenon are perceived, and in which it's a situational position in which planetary phenomenon is lived and understood. And obviously there are modes of differentiation and diversification, particularly at a cultural level, that organize around those situatedness, but that situatedness itself is itself situated within a larger condition that is itself always an intrinsically planetary, and that we must always be aware of in this certain kind of context. And so let me leave it at that and throw it to Lukas to see what he thinks about sort of some of this as well. But I would just say that I think we're talking about, if not clear, at least 2 or 3 different kinds of planetarity and 2 or 3 times of ways of even asking the question of where does diversification come from?
Yeah, I mean, despite it is true that the planetary in the geological sense conditions the planetary in any kind of cultural sense, I think that the problem still remains that you very, very quickly run into the possibility of culturally articulating this geological planetarity, or just like mirroring the fact of the geological planetarity by some relevant cultural practices. What I mean by that is that this kind of culture that these kinds of cultural practices can become sort of very existential in a way. As I was recently, I mean, it was just today that I was reading this obituary of Jean-Luc Nancy, who recently passed away. And there was this remark about his understanding of communism as based on actually not finding some kind of common denominator in some essence of the community, but in actually, reckoning with some kind of outsideness of the human existence, of this fact of exteriority that we can link also into the kind of exteriority of the planetary. And so, to me, then, actually, culture doesn't necessarily mean some kind of interiority. It is also something that has, windows, and that actually has many interfaces that allow for the exchanges with these layers that are non-human or pre-human. And so many of these discussions about cosmology, cosmotechniques, cosmopolitics, sometimes I tend to read them as actually kind of proxy debate about cultural relativism versus cultural universalism. And when we realize this fact, we also understand that it's a debate that was here for a very, very long time. And this kind of debate actually wasn't sort of resolved in favor of cultural universalism, but neither in favor of cultural relativism of the kind that we're just happy with saying that things are incommensurable and that's all. I think it's what should be, to me, an ideal resolution of this kind of debate would be to look at the fact that in the end, every culture in this way has rituals of exchange, of communication with other culture. And I mean, in this way, it also links to this kind of metabolic ontology where actually it is almost impossible to seal the culture from the outside influences of any kind. And so that brings me to this idea of interfaciality of the culture as something that is also related to the exchange, not just in the economic, but broadly cultural sense. And what is also completely lost in these debates is sometimes the question of agency and consent over some exchange and transaction happening. I think it's also the reason why this debate became so politically prominent in different scenes, in different sort of, disciplines, in the art world, in design, because I think the question is like, who has the say whether some exchange is permissible or legitimate? So it is there in this kind of question where coercion can happen in the lack of consent or in some kind of denial of agency. So, I mean, for example, saying that native inhabitants of the Congo Basin area were example of fetishist cultures strips them of their economic agency, because it is a kind of like a Western anthropological perspective that deliberately misrecognizes these kind of economic practices as religious rituals. The same comes with technical agency of non-Western cultures. Like the technical agency of non-Western cultures is many times not recognized, especially in Western discourses about technology. We say that divination of, for example, Nigerian Ifa tradition is just about religion, but in fact, it's about agency of abstraction and inventing complex mathematical systems before complex mathematical systems of the European origin. And so in this sense, like, this is what is important to me, to actually seeing ways how to secure the agency and the ability to give consent to the transaction happening. And in that way, I think that the planetary is first and foremost a generic space in which this kind of agency and consent can be distributed for the kind of like benefit of all those that are involved in the metabolic exchange happening in this generic space of the planetary.
Yeah, let me just echo that a little bit around this phrase, the generic space of the planetary. I think one of the maybe it's things, but I think to your point about like why these conversations have been taken up so with such energy and sort of art and design kinds of things as well, I think to a certain extent has to do with a sense of a kind of a superficial reception of a rather sort of complex philosophy in the cosmotechnics tradition, but a kind of superficial recognition that there's an alibi for a kind of simple cultural determinism and symbolic determinism and sovereignty of the symbolic over the technical and the real that congratulates all of the kind of Goethean romantic obligations of the Western art world to differentiate itself in this kind of with this kind of moral position. But on this more important question of the genericness of the planetarity, I think one of the issues where Luke and I kind of slip a little bit around each other, and sometimes in the conversation, is around the question of to what extent is the European Western model of the universal a stand-in for the question of the generic and the universal in relationship to the planetarity as a whole, and to what extent is it recognized as being a counterfeit universal? That is, the Western model of the universal is quite obviously not universal. It is a provincial, parochial, limited, self-congratulatory cultural tradition that invented a concept of the universal and saw itself in that concept and propagated a notion of universality in relationship to its own kind of automimetic, machine. But I think the maneuver to be made is to refuse that recognition, to refuse the recognition that Western model constitutes the real universal, if you like, or the universal that predates the possibility of any of these conversations, which is, I think, going back to this first geological condition of the planetarity, that is a generic planetarity that is a universal, that is a predicate to these conversations. It also opens the possibility for a universal to come predicated on that generic, on what they're recognized, that is absolutely in Lukas' tradition, that is a more accurate and realist understanding of the technical history of human thought, whether it's Nigerian or German, in terms of the capacities for abstraction. The idea that abstraction and mathematics and technical reason is somehow a Western imposition on colonized societies is the primary core ideology of the colonial logic itself that needs to be refused. Which is why I find it weird, honestly, that there are some partisans of the cosmotechnics tradition, not Uke necessarily, but some partisans of the cosmotechnics tradition that actually will sort of repeat this recipe to suggest that the technical reason and abstraction and the mathematization and instrumentality and so forth and rationality, so forth and so forth, is this kind of Western hegemony that needs to be refused on behalf of a kind of improvisational irrationality. Again, where the art world comes in to all of this as well. I think the universal to come needs to refuse this. It needs to de-link and delaminate the very premise of the universal from those traditions, so that there can be the decolonization process is this recovery of the common heritage of abstraction upon which any future that we would want to build depends.
It's also a very Western way how to answer it, because it's actually a Heideggerian solution to what is the essence of technology in the end.
Right. Well, there's a whole nother discussion we have about why. I mean, Lukas is a really interesting writer, thinker, and a good friend of mine. So I don't mean to take this as any sort of way. It's all sort of in dialogue. Other people have recognized it's strange that the call for a kind of de-Europeanization of the philosophy of technology is totally oriented around Heidegger and Hegel and Stiegler, which, it ends up being actually the most Europeanist spine of thinking possible in terms of its orientation to recovery. But this is another.
Yeah, it's just a footnote. One more thing that comes to my mind in this respect is that what kind of different ontology of technology this invites. And it kind of taps into the question that also you, Ben, partly posed in the stack, like in terms of computation, how much of it was invented and how much of it was discovered. We can zoom out as talking about technology in general, like how much of the technical capacity and technical agency is discovered, how much of that is invented, how much of that happens in the tandem with the non-human reality.
We have some
yes,
questions.
and how much of it, to your point about the universalism, the kind of anthropological debates of universalism and relativism, like how much of this is actually are isomorphic? Like how much, in a way, is the technical reason of the Pacific Islanders' use of astronomic trigonometry to orient themselves as they move across the ocean, the same trigonometry that the Greeks were working to figure out how far away their cities were from each other. From Yuke's perspective, these are not the same trigonometry. This is the principle of cosmotechnics, that because they are predicated on different mythic foundations, that they constitute different technologies. And to put it bluntly, I think it's an open question. And I think if it's not clear, I'm on Team Universal. I just think the Team Universal means something quite different than Team Western.
We have some questions that relates to this topic from Eric to Benjamin. The planetary, not as scale, but as universal condition of our own existence, does that mean that the planetary is nothing but what can be empirically observed about the planet? And the next, also related, are cosmic and planetary interrelational? Cosmic subsumes planetary at localities?
So I'm not. You could ask the person what they mean by cosmic in this regard. I'm not quite sure. I would say on the first question about the empirical, no. I mean, they're all things that are real that are not empirically, that would be difficult to sort of empirically kind of structure. I mean, empiricism implies an epistemologically observing subject. I think the whole idea is that the reality of the condition of the planetary precedes the emergence of epistemological subjects. This is. Meisso's after finitude being the kind of most eloquent explication of this point. It's not simply that the planetary is all the things that we can quantify. The planetary is the underlying astronomic condition from which, over a period of time, the possibility for the ultimate evolution of an epistemic subject is even possible in the first place. This is the thing, and I suppose this is invocation of the astronomic. Probably goes to the second question, and that is that another sort of there's the distinctions between a cosmology in a scientific sense of does the Earth go around the sun or the sun go around the Earth? Where are the exoplanets, and what is Neptune made of? This is a cosmology as well. This is different than the cosmology of what is the upon which cultures depend in order to orient themselves and give themselves a narrative meaning and a kind of cultural significance, which is again not just the purview of the cultures that anthropologists used to study and measure, but of all cultures, obviously including our own, in different kinds of ways. What I mean, in a simple sense, I guess I'm saying there's ways in which it could be said that my priority is the first logic of cosmology, that the geophilosophy that is needed is one that grapples first with the astronomic planetary and understands the geophilosophical is in dialogue with this and in this implications, but one comes from the other, rather than a cosmology of clans and race and other kinds of absurdities. But maybe I misunderstand the question, so I'm happy to follow up if you like.
I mean, I would just echo what you say, Benjamin, because saying that cosmic subsumes planetary at localities, to me, that would basically mean that it's what we have also in Heidegger or in other kind of phenomenological tradition with first having the world and then basically the earth as a consequence of the world, but the world in some way is actually the phenomenological. So then you can end up with Husserl saying that actually we will never leave, for example, the earthly coordinates of our aesthetic experience of the space, etc.
So another way of putting that is that if for Heidegger, the sequence goes world and then earth and then later on, in Age of the World picture and the Apollo and the Moonlander images, then it goes planet, world, earth, planet. he has it totally backwards. Planet comes first. Then there is, the terrestriality and the terrestrial conditions for the emergence of, animals with spines, all of which possess different kinds of phenomenal worlds through which they orient themselves, some variously sentient or sapient. I mean, I think this is why, in a certain sense, I talk a little bit about in the book, like, I think there's an argument to be made that of all the thousands and thousands of pages that Heidegger wrote, he doesn't mention Darwin once in all of this. And to me, this is deeply conspicuous, that one would write a history of being and becoming and what a human is in relationship to this, when this was written in the 1920s, and not deal with it in this way. There's a way in which you can read the entire Heideggerian project as a massive cope evasion of the implications of evolutionary science.
Maybe there's two more terms that we can invite to this debate about the relation of the cosmic and the planetary, and that's like two connotations of the totality. Like in the I'm gonna have the Agamben moment and do a bit of Greek etymology, like with the pan and holon distinction. Like you have the pan, the open totality, holon, the closed totality, and I think that's actually also this distinction that becomes a bit forgotten in these debates, when totality basically means something that is like, the sealed globe, this kind of like world interior, this kind of like Sloterdijkian sense. And this open totality, maybe that's in this sense of the Greek word pan, that will be the kind of cosmic that may still precede the planetary, but it is the kind of cosmic that the planetary actually is a very nice manifestation of, not something that is just, somehow in a hierarchical relation to.
Yeah, I mean, even echoing that further, I mean, there's an argument to be made that the planetary as an object of thought, like how it is that we came to grasp the planetarity as this condition was dependent upon the extraplanetary. I mean, even the simple kind of remarks like the overview effect and blue marble and things like this as well, that it's by going outside, to your point, that the condition of the planetarity becomes possible in this regard, which is also, again, why I think there's actually quite a lot at stake philosophically, politically, culturally, otherwise, for our ventures off planet, outside the atmosphere, and the kinds of exteriorizations and alienation, the kinds of venturing into the openness of that open totality, rather than the crystal palace of the globe that's at stake. And so
that brings me to your remark about Marxist and space exploration, because if I look into the Marxist history, actually there is at least one planet that is really loved in Marxist cosmology, and that's Mars, for its redness.
No, of course, I'm being facetious. I mean, obviously all the best space exploration was done by Marxists, from Bogdanov and Red Stars you talk about, and the whole Soviet program and all the rest of this stuff as well. Without a doubt, and the history of Marx, space exploration by Marxist countries is a priceless part of our common heritage. What I was simply meaning was like the way in which in 2021, I put it this way, that part of the kind of the fallout of these stupid billionaire stunts of Bezos and Musk Branson going up and coming down at this kind of point, has been an orientation of the popular discussion around space as being basically about exit or no exit. Like the whole point of space is to exit the planet and to basically give up on Earth and go somewhere else, and to sort of to secede in some way. And so the referendum on space is a referendum on secession versus not secession. And if you're against secession, you're against space. I mean, I'm being reductive, but that's kind of the way it's talked about in The Guardian. And similar kinds of venues, what I'm simply saying is this is absolutely the wrong frame by which to understand what's at stake for extraplanetary.
I mean, my point was just that without the kind of extraplanetary, we wouldn't even have communism. But you took it much further. Thanks for that.
We have some more questions here. There was one big question from some time ago I don't know who sent it. Maybe it's Rafael himself. Bratton just made a point about the cross-fertilization, if we will, between the geotechnological and the geopolitical. Lukas also got to the limit between postulating a neat separation between the political and the economical. I'm curious to hear you about what would be the implications of modeling new forms of abstraction when we consider this porosity between those terms and their frequent political separation in discourse.
Lukas, why don't you take this one? I've taken the lead on most of the questions, which is not fair. So why don't I hand you the?
Yeah, it's the most complicated question so far. I mean, the very initial intuition. I was thinking, like, we have economy and ecology. We have technology. So where's technonomy, and what would that mean? And it is not just about having nice 4-4 structure where we would have that we have one term missing here. So let's invent what's technonomy. But there is something about the way how technology is a material carrier of culture and abstraction. And in that sense, I would seek the, any ways of opportunities for modeling new forms of abstraction, especially in the domain of the technical. But what I mean by that is not necessarily big humming machines or computation. What I mean by that is also like a technique in the way more like German media theory understands it as a cultural technique. So because with abstraction of any kind, also, I guess, it generates as a kind of singularity also some kind of, ensemble of the practices around. So with, for example, the abstraction of the carbon, we can, of carbon as a kind of, the greenhouse gas, we also get a lot of potential for thinking about things like carbon care and actually directing different kinds of practices, which would be conventionally called geoengineering, into the more cultural veins. And so, for example, it can even lead to imagining rituals of, for example, communal carbon drawdown or whatever you want to imagine. And I think it's a kind of imagination that makes me very hopeful in actually seeing, these possibilities of the historical change through setting some kind of infrastructural framework that generates a lot of cultural diversification around itself. But I think I led the question somewhere else than it was initially where it initially departed from. But as for abstraction, I really think that we need to look into like how much we can get out of, this meeting between the cultural and the technical.
Yeah, and I think that, I'll just very, very quickly so we can have more questions, just as there's I think where we get the meeting between the cultural and the technical is to not accept the distinction in the first place in a way or another, just, the attention towards the technical condition of the cultural as a physical fact, as a physical instantiation of information and concepts and, at a neurological level, at a mediational level or anything else. And also at the same time, understanding the ways in which that the evolution and formation of those technical systems is itself driven by the concepts that make them, that give them order and give them logic and give them reason and to give them a sense of artificiality and practicality. So it's just, I think, and obviously, from Stiegler on through, there's there's a whole number of different, or McLuhan for that matter. There's any number of ways in which that's already been established. It's just, I think the strange thing is not that hasn't occurred to anyone. It's a constant theme, in fact, within a kind of side current of Western theory of technology. What's interesting is that it keeps getting forgotten. Like we keep coming back to this as if this is news, as if the conflation of the cultural and the technical is like this, bringing this together as some kind of innovation. Or because, and it only, this is the thing, because in so many places, and I will say the art world probably most egregiously, they are conceptualized as metaphysically distinct from one another and with an obvious hierarchy.
I would add one more thing to that a lot of abstraction in the Western intellectual culture is based on visual templates. And to me, it's an open question whether we should stick with that or look into like more haptic, sonic, performative kinds of our sources of abstraction. I can give you one example. When I was recently on Iceland with a film documentary crew, we were doing a documentary about sonic landscapes, and we have visited a geothermal power plant. And to me, it was a very interesting experience to actually seeing how a certain abstraction of the, massiveness and the pervasiveness of the infrastructure on contrary concretized in the sonic experience, and actually the kind of pervasiveness of that sonic experience, that wherever you go, you have this 50 kilohertz hum. Wherever you go, you have a lot of different noises that still, indicate the fact that even if the infrastructure is, for example, underground, it is still there. And the same holds, for example, when we were listening to the glacier melting. The kind of experience there was actually extremely planetary, and yet it was very placed, very concrete. And I think that on top of just crafting new abstractions, it also can invite us to actually seeing many ways in which in the future what we consider to be abstract actually gets extremely concrete also in our phenomenological experience.
Yep, very much agree. Yep.
We have a question from Eric. In Revenge of the Real and interviews around it, you, Benjamin, talk about the agent that models and compositions itself in the singular, as if this unitary agent already exists. I think this is a major point of critique, because what agents do that, how much there are, and what agent, okay, I think this is a major point of critique, because what agents do that, how much there are, and what their relations to one another matters very much. So the question is, what critique accurate? The question, is that critique accurate? And if yes, what are the dangers of accepting this formulation without actively building such an agent, and then how to build such an agent?
I'm not sure I agree with I don't think I said that. I think I may have said something quite opposite of that. I think I don't remember anywhere I saying that the question of sensing and making sense and modeling is to be left to individual agents or atomized agents. In fact, my point was the opposite of that. I was saying that first, one of the implications of the epidemiological view of society is that the conditions of the individual are always trans-individual in the formulation, that the boundary of one organism to another organism as objects and as subjects is permeable. And so the modeling of oneself and one's relations has to also be trans-individual, just to be accurate, just to sort of be real, like that. And the vectorial flows of the epidemiological is not just a way of modeling the social, but also a way and one's objectivity within the social, but therefore also a way of modeling the subjectivity. And then second, there's a whole section of the book where I make like a rather, I thought was very, very sort of clear criticism of the uses of planetary scale computation in ways that are overly individuated, that are preoccupied with the individual user and the individual agent as the relevant object, which I extend to a critique of the critique of surveillance capitalism in the Zuboff sort of model, which, as I see it, it says all kinds of like relevant things about why advertising-driven platforms have, do these pernicious things, which I don't disagree with. But the conclusion is always that this degraded, molested, duped individual, atomized individual agent now needs to counter-weaponize himself and re-privatize himself and re-anonymize himself, but against this pernicious platform. But in other words, what's never questioned is the idea that the primary use for planetary scale computation should be the modeling of individual agents in the first place. It shouldn't. And that's why I also then talk about climate science as a better model for thinking about what planetary scale computation is and can be. And so I'm maybe I'm confused on the question, but I don't think there's any argument that I make at all about the primacy or importance of individual self-modeling in this regard at all. Quite the opposite.
I mean, building on what you say, imagine for example, allocation of the carbon budget. Like, it would be a fatal catastrophe if it happens on the individual level, I guess, that the carbon budget should be rather distributed on the levels which are municipal, communal, or even like reflect the kind of inequalities that cannot be always break down to the individual terms.
Yes, at the same time, people who fly in private jets every day, of which there, don't take up an inordinate amount of the collective carbon budget. And so I don't think, at the same time, I strongly agree that infrastructural issues need to be understood at the scale of the infrastructure, not at the scale kind of neoliberal nudge and behavior change. People are going to turn on light switches whenever they want to turn on a light switch if they can. The issue is to make sure the energy source at the other end of that is non-pathological. That's not and so focusing on how often you turn on the light switch or nothing is completely nonsensical. Private jets is a different story. I would just say. So I don't think we're in disagreement. I don't think we're in real disagreement on this as well. I'm just saying it's like there's also like it's absolutely certain that there are carbon gluttony. Is an issue that only makes the infrastructural transformation much more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, with private jets, what you actually invoke is the class division of the society, and that's again a kind of collective division. Yeah,
of course. Yeah.
Well, since we don't have questions here at the box right now, I'd like to ask you something in the sense that, well, okay, if we, I think we are looking at a picture which is, and I think this part of your answer of both of you was really a good point, the sense that the planet is not a scale in itself. It's like the sum and the superimposition of all of the scales, right? But we are, at the same time, we're trying to put those scales in the right order in a way, right? We're trying to see which is piled up upon which. So we're trying to like build a kind of a systems theory which accounts for this, not the wrong way around, right? And then this kind of puts this, experiential phenomenological worldly picture at a specific level. And I think this, and then, the possibility that the changes in all of the infrastructure in other levels can radically, tear apart and restructure this kind of phenomenological level, in the whole like accelerationist imaginary of the, complete abandoning of this form of the human and the possibility of intelligence to be transposed into other infrastructures. That poses the question of nihilism, right? In the sense that one way to see value is that, people ascribe value to things that are related to their world picture in this, parochial phenomenological sense. And maybe that's why people resist so much to leave behind this kind of world picture. And the possibility of intelligence always re-implementing itself in more and more different levels poses the question, what for, right? Like, how is value or meaning related to this? And then I can like pose a question in terms of this. Talking to J.P. Cajon, which is also an instructor at New Center, about Reza's position, it seems like you could read Reza as having two different positions about this. Like at the time of the labor of the inhuman, it would seem like you have like a fact value distinction, and then the way you're restructuring the normative models of the human, it kind of allows you to also restructure values, right? You can restructure values according to the new modes of life or modes of existence, which might be inorganic. At each different level, you have a kind of a freedom to also repose the normative. And then by the time Raza is finishing Intelligence and Spirit, it seems he's becoming more Platonist, right? In the sense of equating basically the value or the good with knowledge and intelligibility itself. Like, you should just like leave behind all of those like, parochial ideas of what is valuable. Like what is valuable is the extraction of intelligibilities. And I wanted to know, ask you this question of like nihilism and value in this process of planetary development and even extraplanetary development of intelligence, and in the context of those different possibilities as well, or maybe other possibilities that you might think of.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So I should first say, let me hold on to the thought about the form, value, and normative with the question of the human. Like, I should first say that I don't think of myself as an accelerationist. I honestly don't know what the word means anymore. It seems to have so many different kinds of meanings that it only will invite misunderstanding. But the version that you characterize of a kind of like abandonment of human phenomenology on behalf of something else, it would seem to me rather unnecessary. I think that the evolution of primate sentience and human sapience and the cognitive revolution of 30,000 years ago and the capacities for abstraction and industry that the species possesses are dependent upon the worlds that we inhabit and we make sense from, which as well. This is a priceless accomplishment. I think what I'm suggesting is rather that one of the accomplishments of that capacity is to understand the actual material conditions of that capacity, and that the project for intelligence has to be one. In other words, that's in concert with what you're suggesting at the end of Intelligence and Spirit, that intelligibility is a good in and of itself. We can add to that list intelligibility of intelligibility, the intelligibility of intelligence, understanding its own evolutionary conditions, which is, we could call it, neuroscience. We could call it, engineering under other kinds of conditions. You'll have to ask Reza whether the connotation he has for that is more that the good and the normative are the same thing, and that the good and the normative are reducible to intelligibility, or whether he means that intelligibility is an intrinsic good in and of itself that is indistinguishable from, or should be, the engine of the normative. And those to me are two different things. And you'll have to ask him how he would parse that. The idea, though, the way you pose it about instead of the distinction of form and value, that there's ways in which the value is in fact not only built into the form, but is a way of, there's a kind of laboratory of values that is possible through the manipulation and exploration of forms, of the human at an anatomical level, of the human at a conceptual register, the human as an open arc, which obviously through anthropogeny and evolutionary science, we understand that it is, right? I mean, there were times where we live in a particularly rare moment where there's only one human species on Earth. For most of the existence of humans, there have been multiple human species on Earth. And so quite obviously the diagram of the human is quite plastic in that regard. And so I think the question is, I wouldn't say that it is, I'm not arguing that the question of value and the question of the normative comes down to what shape will humans have later on. Because I think, going back to your first point, I think one of the things that I would hold on to is that the thing that is precious has been this accomplishment of sapience and auto-intelligibility, and as a kind of, as Tsiolkovsky would say, as a medium of how the planet thinks, humans as a medium for how the planet thinks about itself. That's the precious part. The fact that it used a particular species as its shuttle for this particular point in time is less relevant. And so that's where the opening towards non-carbon based or non-human forms of intelligence is part of the ethics of the future, the ethics of the future of intelligence going forward. And it's also where there's a decentering of the human as the necessary condition of intelligence, in a kind of Copernican decentering of the human as a necessary condition of intelligence. But that's not at all to say that the phenomenon we recognize as human phenomenology is to be demoted or degraded or defamed. It's in fact, it's the state of the art, and is likely to be the state of the art for quite some time. And so its cultivation and recognition is due all manner of respect. Where obviously I would defer from most phenomenologists and affect theory and even a lot of so-called new materialists, is the idea that this phenomenology itself represents that it is a kind of interiority that is separate from the world and in some sort of way, and that its contemplation of itself and the sort of the experience of thinking constitutes a different kind of treasure than the scientific self-objectification and alienation as a form of self-exploration. It's that distinction that is often made, again, particularly in the art world, that I would reject. I would suggest that the second one, that self-objectification, is the condition for the experience of one's own experience and the contemplations of oneself as a subject. In other words, you can only get at what it means to be a subject through getting at what it means to be an object. You can only get at what it means to be a subject through passing through what it means to be an object. And I think that's where we totally depart from a lot of other ways in which phenomenology is invoked.
This question of the retrieval of value, I think I would break it down to two moments, and that's the retrieval of meaning and retrieval of norms. On the one hand, retrieval of meaning as something that is associated with some projective capacities of the human subject. And then we have retrieval of norms. In the story, as it usually goes, it starts with the retrieval of meaning, and then we get norms out of that by some kind of conceptual process. But I guess I would flip this, and instead of saying this, I would basically see a possibility of retrieval of norms out of the pre-human reality and deriving meaning out of that. Because to me, it many times seems that actually this retrieval of norms from the pre-human world is not totally arbitrary. If you look at evolutionary constraints and pressures, if you look at thermodynamics, if you look at recursivity, all these are different examples of something that I would call something like a rudimentary norms, or some kind of archaic norms, ecological norms, perhaps even. And these preformat the space of not yet born, space of meanings in this way. I guess someone who's better versed in inferentialism can actually take it up at this point and continue with actually how different inferential chains of reasoning can be, derived out of this. But this is something like a very basic starting point for me to actually seeing this relation between retrieval of meaning and retrieval of norms more tilted towards the side of norms being actually partly pre-human. Of course, there's a large realm of normativity, which is human crafted. And one of the dangers in saying this is actually that it may open doors to ways of naturalization of the political that can equally justify, for example, saying that cooperation is good because primates cooperate, but it can also justify race suprematism, patriarchy, and many types of social pathologies that are actually justified by these kinds of naturalization strategies. So I understand it's also a territory which is very contested and problematic in this way, but I would still maintain that there is a realm of rudimentary norms which are kind of that are conditioned, or not conditioned, but condition actually the rest of the normative landscape, that this kind of topology that I was talking about at the very beginning. And as you were talking about the scale, go on, Benjamin.
No, it's an interesting sort of point. To the extent, I think what you're doing here is you're basically saying, okay, if we're going to collapse form and form and norm in this way, then you got to sort of follow this through and understand that the form that extant form must thereby have been a condition of previous norms in some way, in certain sort of way as well, right? And so that could extend all the way to the cosmological anthropic principle, to the kind of Chomskyan shift in linguistics that the brains are preconditioned to organize around certain kinds of linguistic structures, that like the possibility of language itself is already anatomically predetermined, which itself was an effect of the use of language, right? And that backwards and forwards, right? The old adage that we have opposable thumbs, not so that we can use tools, but that because our ancestors used tools, we have opposable thumbs, and that dynamic back and forth. I think what's peculiar here and is worth then some meditation, and I don't know that we'll have sort of time to sort of go through it, has to do with the status of the contingency of those norms or the artificiality of those norms. That one of the things that intelligence makes possible is our artificial norms, in ways in which it becomes possible to decide that something will be normed and be shaped in some way. And I think this is the basic of lithics within basic Paleolithic and Neolithic culture, from stone axes through other kinds of tools, like giving form and shape to something in the interest of practical reason in some way or another is the beginning of the artifact. It's also the beginning of the artificial norm and therefore form of this thing as well. And so I don't question the constraint norms as constraints that have been a kind of blind evolutionary dynamic over time that make possible the possibility of thought, like the evolution of a brain that learns a language in 3 years. Is the question then, I pose this as a question, is how correspondent or connected is that to the notion of norm in the speculative and projective sense, which is, I think, where Reza is more going with this, of like norms as norm giving and norm shaping, which also I should say is, I think, correspondent with the discussion around governmentality that we're having at the beginning, of how it is that a society self-composes, organizes of an understanding governmentality as this self-formalization and self-composition, not as a set of laws hit you on the head with like a hammer. That governance can be understood as about the technical and legal process of that giving normalization to the society that might actually persist.
Yeah, in other words, it's also about this duality, or this kind of like pressure between self-legislation and necessity, or autonomy and necessity. But I still maintain that actually you need this genealogy of normativity that also you so nicely described to actually understand. So what is the maneuvering space of this self-legislation capacity? And that actually brings me to one more point when I say about genealogy of normativity. When one of the moderators invoked scale again and said that both of us, both you, Ben, and me, have this tendency to say that the planetary is not the scale. It is also interesting to look into to what extent we can replace the spatial scaling with temporal scaling. It also brings me back then to the genealogy and to the geological, in that way that we can imagine this normativity basically as a kind of, or this kind of genealogy of norms as something that is vertical, something that is based on these geological temporalities. And then basically we can see this alignment between, ancestrality of norms and ancestrality of certain layers. So I think that's the way how we can further play with this and push it also to the question of self-legislation.
Should we take like I don't know if we are counting for 2 hours or if we can extend more, but maybe this we have a maybe last question here by Dylan. Is not discussion of a rational planetarity, governmentality, etc., a premature post-capitalism? The solution to the twin crises of automation and Anthropocene, a la the terraforming, requires a truly self-reflective social humanity. Marx' human naturalism rather than the folk humanism Bratton critiques. For automation to actually automate autonomy, the logic that inhabits it from doing that would need to be overcome.
Well, I'm not sure that the purpose of automation is to automate autonomy. I'm not sure autonomy is the goal of all of this as well. I think there's a condition of interdependence that is kind of the principle of the ecological or epidemiological or planetarity that we would want to not only recognize but compose. And it would particularly not mean autonomy as a kind of the kind of atomized libertarian notion of autonomy of this as well. I understand that there's ways in which, for example, Pete Wolfendale talks about automation of autonomy in a rather different valence to mean the sort of the capacity for self-production and self-fashioning and self-formation, which would be something to correspond as a precondition of this, the governmentality as self-composition. And in that regard, fine. I don't know if it's premature or not, or whether or not it's actually quite late in the game. It kind of depends a little bit on like how much time you think we have left to kind of deal with this. I suppose my sense of the clock is less that it's, again, I'm not arguing that this is like we're going to wake up next year and reason will have won history finally. But rather it's really kind of like working backwards, trying to sort of work backwards from the condition of what would if the deep time of the future was as long as the deep time of the past for complex terrestrial sapiens on Earth, what would be the conditions at this moment that would most likely allow for that to be possible? I think for me, that's kind of what philosophy needs to be. The philosophy needs to be working on, and for politics for that matter, and engineers for this matter as well. It's kind of like the kind of question. So I don't know. I don't know if it's premature. I think on the question of capitalism and post-capitalism, I think there's ways in which the term capitalism can be used rather specifically, and the ways in which it can be used generically, and ways it can be used kind of in ways that it kind of means everything and nothing at the same time. There's certainly value form critiques and surplus labor value critiques and class-based critiques and all the rest of kinds of things as well. But I would say that, at least from my perspective, is that I think we're kind of in a moment where this replay of the Cold War logics of you've got state systems versus capital systems, centralized systems versus decentralized systems, authoritarian systems versus libertarian systems, that the kind of, like the Foursquare politogram kinds of things, like what the issue is not within the Foursquare politogram, the kind of Joshua Citarella politogram, within the framework of authoritarian versus libertarian, or left versus right, however, like all within that strict framework, all manner of insanity is possible. Posadism, anarcho-monarchy, like anything you can think of in relation to this framework you'll find the Reddit group for. The problem is the framework itself. The problem is that those axes and that matrix is probably not a very good diagnostic mechanism for what's going on. It certainly doesn't explain China, what the hell China is in relationship to this as well. Like you can locate it in particular places, but it doesn't really work. And so I'm not so sure on the premature, and I'm not so sure on the post-capitalism. I think that I'll end on this point. I think if there were hypothetically the socio-technical economic transformation that would make these kinds of shifts possible, the matrix of institutions that would exist would be ones that are likely not really clearly legible as capitalist or non-capitalist, as state or non-state, as left or right. It's not that I'm suggesting that they're all central, or that centrism in the middle is to split the middle and we'll find the way. I'm suggesting that this taxonomy is exhausted, and it's not even describing what's going on, let alone describing what needs to happen.
I think my answer will be more methodological because I don't think it's premature from the reason that even though it's projective in nature, this kind of projection helps you to, somehow backlight the present condition or the present moment so that you can actually see the seeds of those historical trajectories that can lead to the realization of these projects. And that's the first reason why I don't think it's premature. And the second is that when I see these terms like post-capitalism, automation, and talking about Marxism and social humanity, I think that for example, this kind of Marxist project of social humanism also actually is abolitionist in its nature, that actually it tends towards abolishing a certain perspective on the human as, for example, a laboring animal. And in that sense, also, I think we can suddenly find a very nice alignments between, let's say, this kind of like Marxist abolitionist project and, for example, Sylvia Wynter talking about overrepresentation of men and looking at other potentials for composing the idea of the human. And so that's the second reason why I don't think it's premature, because actually it brings a very important kind of philosophical project into the focus, and that's the reconstitution of the human also, let's say, from the decolonial perspective of the Wynter and the others.
Well, we're getting at 2 hours. I think it's about time we wrap it up. Eric just made a clarification that his question wasn't so much about the individual in the sense of the, biological human individual, but the idea of a single planetary collective actor. But anyway.
Oh, I see. No, I don't think that's necessary. I see the point now. I think I specifically say in the book is like the fact that you would have operation at the planetary scale does not mean that you have a singular entity that is supervising this in any kind of in any sort of way. And so this isn't an argument that I'm fashioning. I think the thing that I discuss towards the end of the book in relationship to what you might think of as a biopolitical stack that would constitute the basis of the positive biopolitics, it kind of presumes divisions of labor and both different kinds of technologies and laboring bodies and different forms of expertise that constitutes a common infrastructure that would actually allow for that common thriving. I think the idea that there has to be a kind of central office where the deck of the enterprise, where all of this is organized from a command position, is not at all. It's certainly not the argument that I'm making in that book.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank you guys. It was really an enlightening conversation. A lot of, at least for me, a lot of important points and clarifications. We would like also to remind everyone again about the deadline for scholarship applications for certificate students, which is in the 6th of September. So you can get to study at the New Center for free and also with partial scholarships. The info for the application process is available on the New Center website and social media. And if you have any questions about the application process, you can send an email to studentservices@newcenter.org.
I'd also like, if I use it to make a plug for the application process of the terraforming program. We have the 3rd year of the terraforming. Lukas knows about the Stelco program very much. We've had a number of New Center, both graduates and affiliates involved with this. We'll be announcing the 3rd year, which will be focusing a little bit more on issues of artificial environments. The capacity for habitat in the middle of September, and I would certainly invite everyone who's interested in the program to take a look at it.
Yeah, I underscore that as a former alumnus and also a faculty member. It's a really program worth of taking.
Thanks. Yeah, that's very, very nice to.
And it's free. There's no scholarships because we actually pay you.
Good point as well. Well, thank you guys very much. And yeah, do you want to say anything, Zenobio, or Lukas? Do you want to plug anything else? So yeah, thanks everyone, and see you next time. And please keep watching the rest of the season, which is starting now, of Sheltering Places. I hope everyone enjoyed it.
Very much. Thanks very much for the invitation. It was a great conversation. Thanks, Lukas. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.